truly believe that when you're talking about young people, they must meet people who think differently.
Hello, team, and welcome to Beerocracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross. I'm very excited today because I have Arie Perliger with me, and we're going to be talking all about political extremism and violence, unfortunately, in the increasing wake of political violence in our country, especially in light of what just happened to Charlie Kirk. So, Arie, really happy to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So, before we begin, what are we drinking?
Just water, to be honest.
See, so responsible.
Yeah.
I'm not. I have a high noon.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's great.
It's only Tuesday, but it feels like the longest week of my life. So cheers.
Cheers.
Okay, the question I always love to ask my guests is, why should we trust what you have to say?
Probably for three reasons. First of all is because for the last 25 years, I collected huge amount of data about political violence, political extremism, radicalization, and so on. One of the things that I'm trying to do is really take those very sensitive, sometimes controversial topics and really try to focus on the evidence, on the data, on what actually the data tells us, rather than what we would like to think sounds good, what we may think that some of our audiences or constituencies want to hear from us. I really care about what actually is going on. What are the factors that facilitate those kind of phenomena, and so on. So I think that's one reason. Everything that I write, everything that I say, everything that I publish is based on actual data that I'm using. The second thing I think is that in many ways, I've really studied these things that are more difficult to study. So for example, my first book, and I grew up in Israel, which probably anyone who will do some research will find out. My first book and my first research was actually about Jewish terrorism in Israel, about a religious Jewish terrorism in Israel. And I'm talking about a time where everybody was focusing on different other types of terrorism, especially Israeli scholars. The first book I published when I moved to the US was actually about far-right extremism. And that was, or the first big report study. And that was during times where everyone who talked to me about extremism was focusing on Al-Qaeda and jihadi extremism and about, a Middle Eastern terrorism and so on. When I came up with the idea of writing a book about far-right extremism and collect data about far-right extremism in the US, everybody thought I'm crazy. Everybody said, why you actually want to focus on such a minor issues that nobody actually cares about. That was like 2012, 2011. And by the way, I'm not sure how much, so I'm actually write that in my book about far-right extremism. The reaction to me publishing that research, at that time I was a faculty at West Point, was really interesting. First of all, tons of donors pulled back money that they already committed to West Point because it says it's not acceptable that West Point will publish a research about far-right extremism. The superintendent of West Point got hundreds of calls to sack me because they believe that, as a federal institution, as a military university, there's no reason for us to study a phenomenon that they believe doesn't exist. And they believe that my research is really politically motivated. Although anybody who read that will see that it's a very academic, data-driven study. So, so that's another reason why I should trust it, because I do go and research things that people do not usually pay attention to. My upcoming book is actually focusing on extremist misogyny. I'm looking into different communities that engage in violent extremist misogyny in the US. So I'm really focusing on things that I think are important. I don't really care much about what other people think are important. And the last thing is because I do it for a long time, and I do believe, and also because I think I'm very nonpartisan. I know that I'm pissing off a lot of my colleagues in many cases, and sometimes even my students, which is fine, but I really don't care. I'm very straight shooter about it. And in this sense, I'm also very critical about many of my academic colleagues on those issues. So yeah, hopefully that's enough reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to dive into some of those controversies. But obviously for some background for people who are been living under a rock. Charlie Kirk, the political conservative commentator, I really hate the word activist because to me that has like different connotations, but very prominent political conservative commentator who built up a huge conservative movement, especially among young people, was brutally shot and killed. The video is horrific. I don't recommend watching it. It's terrible. And it's begun this huge conversation, which had already been rumblings reaching up to the surface, about violence and in response to politics, right? And we've reached a place in our society where we're unfortunately seeing a lot of political violence. There has been multiple attacks on people who, like disagreeing with and elected officials, attempted assassinations, completed assassinations on all areas of the political spectrum. And I will just say this, I feel like our society has just forgot the word nuance. Like, I'm like, geez, it makes me insane. I was like, did anyone forget about critical thinking skills? But you can think that someone dying is bad, someone being killed is bad, and also think that the words that they said were also really harmful and hateful. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. And for some reason, we found our way in this Charlie Kirk dialogue that that's often been the case, which I think is kind of crazy to me. You don't have to agree with that, but that's just my 2 cents. Now, Arie, what has the data been showing about political violence in America today? How is it different from the history of the country, from when it first started to where it's at now? Is it worse it's ever been? What's it showing?
So we definitely see in the last, basically since 2008, there's some fluctuations, but we do see increase in levels of political violence. Whether these are hate crimes, whether these are political assassinations, whether these are attacks against property, the overall trend is very clear for the last 15, 17 years. Again, there are some fluctuations, but overall we see that. Especially in the last 4 years, our data shows a dramatic increase in incidents of political violence. And in this sense, and it's important to understand that political violence is a very broad concept. But what that I think reflect the fact that violence for political goals, it's something that is being normalized. It's something that is becoming more and more accepted. And we also see that in the data that shows that on both sides of the political spectrum, so I'm talking about 20-something of the very progressive and the very conservative, think that political violence is justified under some conditions. So we also see that on both sides of the extreme margins of the political spectrums, we see more and more willing to accept that sometimes political violence is actually fine. Now, I completely agree with you about the flattening and the simplification of our political discourse, but I want to actually explain, if it's okay with you, why I think this is the case. We are experiencing, I think that's something that most people accept, we are experiencing a significant political polarization that is increasing in the last couple of decades. Now, there's 3 ways in which this political polarization really impact our environment and facilitate events like political assassinations. The first is that politicians have almost no incentives to reach across the aisle because most of the congressional districts are not competitive. And if they are competitive from the extreme. So whether you are a Democrat or Republican, if you're being challenged, is usually from the extreme progressive or extreme right. So politicians have zero incentives to actually engage in constructive, pragmatic, consensus-building policies. It just operate against them electorally wise. They're going to lose their seats. And we've seen that in the last 10 years. Basically, moderates on both sides are being decimated. And which means that politicians, political figures have strong incentives to go to the extreme, to not engage in any kind of bipartisan efforts, and in general, engage in what we call performative politics, basically playing to the base rather than actually doing what they were elected to do, govern, and actually producing policies. So that's one thing. The second thing is the fact that because of the polarizations, basically, there's no nuance. And the lack of nuance reflected in the fact that political rivals are consistently being demonized, delegitimized, And any kind of willingness to engage in a discourse with the other side is perceived of some kind of a betrayal of your camp, right? God forbid you'll actually be willing to engage in actual discourse with the other sides. And this kind of increased toxicity of the language create a situation where basically almost any kind of policy of the other side is an existential threat. So, I'm tracking for a living, I'm tracking online extremist accounts on both sides. And I remember during the Biden administration, if you look at far-right online accounts, consistently our civil liberties, our constitutional rights are under threat. Antifa are on the gate. They're going to swarm us at any point. Everything is existential. Everything that Biden did is a threat to our civil liberties. And on the left, we see this similar trend. Almost every policy of the Trump administration is existential to the republic. Now, you can think that some of his policies are really bad. Some of them are probably eroding our democracy. But I do think that we need to actually have some kind of nuance and complexities. And the last thing I'm going to say, and I think this is something that I've been asked a lot, right? About why we see so many young people who justify the violence, support the violence, engage in violence. And here, I think what the data shows us is that young people's social skills are declining, are eroding. Because young people have much less interactions with other people in the real world. And most of them spend most of their time in a very homogeneous bubbles where they rarely are being challenged or they're basically in a progressive bubble or a far-right bubble, and that's what they hear. So when they get to the real life and they actually engage with people with contradicting opinions or different opinions, suddenly they are in a crisis mode. How that possible? How that even, and they have a very difficult time to actually handle this. And then you see people like Tyler Robinson and others that suddenly really feel threatened and unsafe just because someone actually is expressing different views. And for granted, some of them are very controversial. But what I'm saying is that young people's ability to deal with challenges to their way of thinking is eroding. I think it's very sad, and I'll finish with that, one of the things that I need to start every class that I'm teaching with is telling students, guys, if someone disagrees with you, it's not an offense. You shouldn't feel threatened. That's what we are doing here. We're actually exchanging ideas.
It's interesting you say that, though, because I've had that thought as well. But a lot of times, a lot of viewpoints, right, that, some people on the right may have do in indirect ways, sometimes indirect ways, threaten the safety and livelihoods for a lot of people that identify, on the left. So it's how do you find the ability to have that conversation where although there may not be a direct, truly a direct threat in that communication, right? The concepts and ideas that a person on conservative side may be espousing do have the ability to harm the person on the left in concept and in theory, right? Because let's say someone on the left is transgender and a person who's on the right is saying transgender people shouldn't exist, So that is, how do you have that conversation without harming the person on the left? And how do you find that common ground when it seems like they're so far apart because one viewpoint doesn't believe in the existence of the other?
I think that as a society, we have some guardrails that we can all agree about. For example, we don't think that anyone should be discriminated or marginalized or being segregated because of his religious beliefs or because of his ethnicity or his racial identity or his gender identity. I think we also, can agree that we do not engage in a speech that its entire intent is to harm people or hurt people, because that's really something which I think civil discourse should not include. But we do need to acknowledge that we have people that are coming from different backgrounds, different experiences, and they have a very contradicting and sometimes extremely contradicting views about those issues. And I think the only way in order to bridge those gaps is by trying to, first of all, engaging in something or bringing back something that really is disappearing from the public discourse, and this is empathy, right? Empathy. We don't see empathy anymore. And I think this is something, and even if I vehemently disagree with you on something, we need to understand that we all have we should all have some kind of empathy and grace to the other side, even if we can be extremely intense about our debates, right? And I don't think that anyone should argue that a group of people or a category of people should not exist. First of all, because it's factually wrong, because they exist, but secondly, because it really doesn't help anyone. So I do think that I tell my students, and when I'm engaging with debates, I tell you can say anything as long as you actually have the evidence in it and there's actual rationale to it. And I think, and as long as we are willing to understand that there's nuances and things are really, really complex, right? And I don't argue that I have all the answers, but I do believe that we really need to rethink the way we're actually exchanging ideas with each other. So, for example, a lot of people in the interviews in the last few days asked me about what it means that it's happened on a campus, right? And I'm telling them campuses for a long time now are not the places where there's actual exchange of ideas or there's actual effective debates. No, campuses became spaces of contention, spaces where both sides are just doing performances. It's basically a performative politics. Nobody's really trying to reach out to the other side in an honest and nuanced way and sensitive way, and really to understand those different views and try to build some kind of a constructive understanding how both things can live together. And I think that that's something that we've seen in the last few years. And this is why, it's funny. This is why, for example, all the events that you see on campuses, there's one speaker. Because God forbid, we actually will have a debate. People are just afraid, are scared. So that's one element. Second element is the fact that there's a lot of censorship on campuses. And I know that many of my academic colleagues will jump on me of how do we say that? But we talked earlier about data. The data shows that more than 50% of the students are censoring themselves in the classroom. And I can tell you that there's a lot of faculty who are censoring themselves. Now, if you have a campus within an environment where people feel uncomfortable to express their views, there cannot be actual effective discourse. And I think that's really unfortunate. So considering the very contentious nature of those spaces, we shouldn't be surprised that so many students feel that campuses are not the best place to actually talk politics.
When you say censors, do you have in that data that you've done, in the way that you've gotten that science, right? That the statistics. Do you have a breakdown on like what the censorship is, like what they feel like they're being censored in and what they can't discuss?
Well, I don't think you can imagine that the data shows very clearly that most faculty in academia are gravitating towards the left, right? I don't think that's necessarily wrong or there's a necessary problem with that. I do think that that's an issue when students feel that the political leaning of their professors prevent them from expressing views or expressing their opinions in an open and honest manner. It's perfectly fine to disagree with your professor, but the professor's role is to create a class climate which students will feel comfortable to challenge him, right? So I can have debates with my students and I'm happy when they disagree with me because it makes the class more interesting, right? Like it makes every debate more interesting if people actually disagree. And in this way, I'm trying to convey to them that disagreements are not some kind of a mental crisis. It's not an unsafe environment. It's actually the natural state of things that we can agree on some things, we can disagree, and it's perfectly fine. It doesn't mean that we need to, necessarily demonize or delegitimize each other. And I do that in because I'm teaching classes about extremism and terrorism and political violence and all those stuff. Very sensitive issues, very controversial issues. And you cannot really have a good teaching experience and learning experience if you're not actually willing to engage in sometimes very difficult views.
No, I do think we've completely forgotten as a society to have conflicting arguments and conflicting opinions and being able to leave it and still like have respect for each other. Yeah. And I think that's very important. So how has social media affected political violence and the extremism we see today?
I think there's the basic operational features that makes organizing and promoting extremist ideologies or violent ideologies. Today, it's much easier. I'm studying terrorism for a long time. In the 70s, 80s, even in the 90s, most illicit organizations, most underground organizations, most illegal organization movements actually had to have infrastructures, places where they can actually meet, places where they exchange ideas. They had to have the tools, to disseminate their ideology. They really had to have an actual physical infrastructure that demanded a lot of resources, demanded a lot of time, demanded a lot from their members. The fact that the emergence of the virtual domain created a situation where a lot of extremist organizations and movements were able basically to exist and to disseminate their ideology and to mobilize recruits and to radicalize individuals with almost zero costs. And what we see is that we have an entire communities online that promote hateful, extremist, violent ideologies. And they can do it with very limited costs, with very limited, concerns for their safety. So I think it makes it much easier to disseminate and to mobilize people to extremist ideologies. The second thing is, I think it created an environment where the most controversial, the most extremist, the most marginal views gain an unproportional visibility. I'll give you an example. Most of the people from the center to the left, most of the people, a great majority of them, express shock for the killing of Charlie Kirk. I think most of the people express that, yes, they think that political violence is unjustified, that it was a horrible murder, etc., etc., etc. But those kind of expressions naturally will get very limited visibility. So anyone who's trying to get a sense of the public discourse will get a sense that, whoa, we have an entire camp that is completely lack any kind of human sympathy to what happened, to the actual murder of a person, right? So I think in many ways it provides us a false understanding of the social reality and how things operate. I've studied in the last few years, I've studied and collected hundreds of thousands of communications on different misogynist communities, whether those are incels and, pickup artists and so on, and tradwives and all those. And you see how they build an alternative reality and how they are mobilizing their algorithms to build an alternative reality and how they can really radicalize and mobilize their members. And social media actually allowed that to happen. And I think, so I think that's one problem. The second problem is what I mentioned before, the fact that so many young people today, their social lives and social interactions are exclusively dominated by their online accounts, that they really have a lot of challenges to deal with real world challenges, and there's many other problems. For example, there's a lot of focus on attributes that were in the past were important, but not as important, right? Such as visual attractiveness. And I can continue on many other factors. But I do think that it completely changed the way our society operates on many different levels.
The fact you mentioned like an alternate reality is really interesting to me, right? Because you've talked about all the science and the data you've gotten. And I'm a person that generally if I see a study and I know where the money's coming from and I know how the study was conducted and I know that it was peer reviewed, I generally will trust the science that comes out of that, right? However, you talk about alternate realities, right? And there is this huge divide in people who have created these kind of alternate realities that are very anti-establishment and anti-science and anti-data. How do you break through? How are you able to show and build that trust that what you've done is something to be trustworthy, even though it doesn't align with the narratives that someone may choose to live in.
So you need to do the legwork. So I'll give you an example. For example, in a lot of universities, in the last several years, they created young men self-help groups. They have different names, but basically the goal is to bring together young male students who have a lot of difficulties in forming social relationships, that have a lot of difficulties to develop their social skills, that have a lot of difficulties to understand social cues and how to operate in different social settings. And the idea is to help them develop those social skills, to make them more apt in managing their social interactions, right? And those are kind of things, for example, those are kind of initiatives that I do think can really change the lives of those individuals, rather than going to a extremely misogynist pickup artist website and just learn how to instrumentalize women and how to seduce them and all those horrible things, right? All the seduction industry, right? Now, what we really try to do, however, is to try to understand the emotional reaction. So what we did, for example, we collected all this huge amount of data from those spaces, and we analyzed the emotional sentiments, the cognitive aspects of how they think about those things, how they frame those things. And then we are trying to develop tools that will enable us to help them get out of this kind of lockdown. And I truly believe that when you're talking about young people, they must meet people who think differently. They must, and I'm not saying that they need to change their views but they need to learn that society is extremely diverse and people think differently. And you can actually, personally, can really evolve and become more a complete and round person when you're actually willing to engage with people that disagree with you. And I think this is an art that we do not really have anymore. And I see that also on campuses, and I think that, and here I'll take another dig in academia. I think that many academics forgot about this and forgot about the fact that more than anything else, academia should be a space where people can actually engage in exchanging ideas and developing a much more nuanced understanding of those difficult social issues, to be honest.
No, absolutely. So how do we off-ramp? How do we stop this dialogue? How do we stop these actions? How do we lower the temperature?
We need to incentivize politicians that they need to work with the other side. I elected you to govern, to promote policies, not to do performative shows on the floor of the House or the Senate. You need to promote policies. And the only way to promote policies is to find ways to work with others, with the other side. And I think that will be helpful for several reasons. First of all, because I think the public will gain more trust that the system can actually work, that the system is not dysfunctional so much. They actually see that Congress can actually work together and actually promote policies. That's one thing. Secondly, it will create better governance. I truly believe that consensus building leads to better governance because it provides more legitimacy to those policies and so on. Thirdly, it sends a very important signals and cues to their constituencies, right? If your congressman is willing to work with the other side, that means that the other side is not the ultimate evil, is not illegitimate, and it actually, there's human beings on the other side that you can actually work with. And I do think that we need to find ways to incentivize our leaders to actually understand that their job is to govern and to promote constructive policies. And probably the only way to do it is actually working with the other side, because executive orders are not the way to govern. We all know that. Like, executive orders are a unilateral coercion and again, we see so many challenges. And I think that in the last few years, we see a inflation of executive orders, right? On both sides, definitely in the current administration, but also the Biden eventually got so frustrated. He also started, but executive orders basically means that you're giving up. that you're giving up on politics, because politics is actually sitting together and come up with some kind of solution that we can agree about. And if you're just running executive orders, that means that you gave up on Congress. Why would you need Congress? So we need to find ways through that to restore faith. And finally, I want to say, and I think that we need to ensure that the different spaces where people from different backgrounds meet, and I'm talking about campuses, are really welcome to everyone. And that people feel safe and people feel that they can express their identity, whether it's their political identity, gender identity, racial identity, in a way that is not threatening for them. And unfortunately, too many spaces, including campuses, became places where a lot of students do not feel safe to express their identity or their views and so on. And it's just awful, because university is the first place where you should be able to do that, really. And I think that that's something that, people who are leading academia and faculty they need to remember that they have responsibility. They are educators. They are role models. So when I see, I'm not sure if you heard, but today they fired like a couple of faculty at Clemson University because of their social media posts. So look, I don't think people should be fired because of their opinions that they're expressing. But I definitely think that too many people forget that they are educators, forget that they are expected to provide actual nuance and sensitivity and when they are expressing themselves. And also, they need to remember that their students are coming from different places and different backgrounds. And when you speak, your students listening to you. And if you engage in speak that is maybe very offensive to some of your students, you cannot really reach out to them. They won't listen to you anymore.
That's an interesting perspective.
Exactly. So, yeah.
Absolutely. No, that's a very interesting perspective. Is there anything else you'd like to touch on?
No, I think I'm good. I think we talked about a lot of stuff. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I'm your host, Emily Gross. We'll be back next week with another episode of Beerocracy.